Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Rob Campbell, and welcome to The Art of Boring, the podcast where we dive deeper into Moore's investment philosophy and thinking in order to make you, our listeners, more informed investors. Ultimately, we hope to connect you with the people at Moore who find excitement in be boring, make money.
This podcast is for informational purposes only. Information relating to investment approaches or individual investments should not be construed as advice or endorsement. Any views expressed in this podcast are based upon the information available at the time and are subject to change.
Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to a special edition of the podcast, because I'm joined today by not one, but two of our analysts within our research team to talk about some of the work that they've done recently on the pharmaceutical industry. So Ahmed, Seeing, great to have you guys. Welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here. Thanks, Rob.
Excited to talk about pharma.
Awesome. Ahmed, I'll start with you. You are a member of our U.S. equity team, but you have a background that is seemingly quite relevant for our conversation today, given that you have a PhD in neuroscience. You studied hypertension specifically. So I'm curious to get your thoughts, just generally speaking, as to how that scientific background, your background in particular, helps in looking at an industry like pharma.
Yeah, that's right. I did get a PhD in neuroscience and then transitioned over here. I guess I took the scenic route like a number of other people. I think it just gives me a different prism through which I look through things. A lot of the scientific method behind investigating hypotheses and testing those with data, I think a lot of that kind of transfers over to the research that I do now, where I'm pretty analytical and focused in that sense.
Great. And Seeing, you're a member of our international team. Your background is in engineering. And I guess I want to get your sense. There's a case to be made, or at least I've heard it said, that along with technology, the healthcare sector is one that maybe requires a pretty specialized knowledge to be able to analyze effectively from an investment perspective. And I just want to get your reaction. We've got a generalist model at Moore where we're looking across the portfolio, across industries and sectors. How do you square that, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think pharma is definitely not an easy industry to look at it. There are many aspects about that industry that's very different from the traditional business models that we look at. And I think the ramp up period for me, when I was looking at pharma companies, it did take a bit longer than others. I think the benefit of coming from kind of a generalist perspective is that I could ask kind of very basic questions and try to understand pharma if that is a good place for us to invest comparing to all the other type of industries that we invest in, instead of trying to pick the best company within this industry. I think ultimately our goal is to achieve the highest return for our investors amongst all publicly listed companies. So if you've been following our other podcast, we don't have any allocations to certain sectors or certain geographies. So I think the benefit of coming from a generalist perspective is also to bring that kind of a very fundamental perspective to looking at this industry. And then on top of that, we also have experts like Ahmed, where I could tap on the shoulder. We actually worked quite a bit on some of the pharma companies I looked at to ask him about some of the questions where one might need a little bit more specialized knowledge.
Yeah, and I guess that's the key, is just having a culture where the automatic reaction isn't to defer to the expert or defer to the knowledge. I mean, that's the benefit of the generalist model, is bringing in that perspective and being able to apply it, as you said, wherever we see capital or opportunities for capital around the world. So just building on that, Seeing a little bit more. So you and Ahmed have done some work together. I mean, that's why we're here today. But you're on two different teams, US and ex-US. What prompted the collaboration that you guys have most recently done together?
It's mostly started from pharma. So I shared within the bigger team that I'm looking into pharmaceutical companies. And Ahmed reached out to me and said, hey, if you ever need any help, I spend some time in the space so we could talk about it. And we had a few conversations. I also looped in Min in some of the management meetings that we had and scuttlebutt meetings, just so that he could also provide that specialized perspective.
Maybe the one thing I'll add is it really helps to have this sort of common investment philosophy and common process, because when Seeing and I were communicating, we're basically using the same language and we have a pretty transparent process as well. And so as Seeing's talking to management teams and doing scuttlebutt, she's recording all that on a database that all the analysts can access. And so I could follow along what she's doing and also then can engage with her on some of this stuff better.
These are pretty global companies too, I would think. And despite the fact that maybe regulations in different parts of the world are different and they may apply differently, some of the themes impacting the pharmaceutical industry, I would imagine, are global in nature, not to mention the fact that many of these companies, despite where they're headquartered, have global businesses as well.
Absolutely, Rob. Yeah, that's correct.
With that, maybe that's a place to start. Just some of these bigger, larger themes that you guys have noticed. Maybe Ahmed, start with you. What are some of these big picture issues that you've noticed impacting the pharma space over the past few years?
Yeah, I can go through a couple. One of the kind of multi-decade theme that we've noticed is just a shift towards more personalized medicine. And the end stage of this would be something like we have a full understanding of individuals' biologic makeup, and we can perfectly customize a therapeutic regime for you specifically, Rob, or Seeing. But we're quite a ways away from that. I think where we've seen a meaningful shift, though, is basically broadening out our therapeutic toolkit for certain diseases. And cancer is one example of this, where now you've got many more therapeutics for different types of cancer and subtypes as well, depending on whether you express a specific type of protein. And another extension of this would be gene therapies, where you have therapies specifically for patient populations that have a single gene that's malfunctioning or missing. I think it's good for patients, but it's also separately perhaps beneficial for pharma companies that see a higher economic return for some of these targeted therapeutics relative to small molecule drugs. So that's one. Just one other to highlight is I think you've seen an increasing focus by some of these big pharma companies that perhaps a decade ago, they used to be large conglomerates that would also house, in addition to their core pharma business, a medical device business, animal health, consumer health. But you've seen a shift over time where they've divested some of these non-core assets and focused a lot more on the pharma business. And I think what we've seen is some of these divestitures have done pretty well on an individual basis once they've been separated from the conglomerate.
Seeing, what about some other themes that you've noticed?
One big theme that I've come across this round of looking at the companies is the decline in return on research and development expenditures for these companies. So they've actually coined it a term. It's called the Aroms Law. And what it is, it's really the opposite of Moore's Law, which is Moore's Law is this law that's widely known as that's applicable to semiconductors. So the cost of making a semiconductor actually got exponentially lower year after year of making them. But Rome's law is the opposite. The cost of making a drug has actually become exponentially higher to bring a drug to market over time.
What drives that?
There are many factors, but essentially there were factors that comes from both the cost and return. So if you think about the return cost equation in the numerator, as Ahmed has mentioned, I think a part of it is that the drugs now are targeting smaller audience because they're becoming more targeted to certain disease areas. It's smaller audience is applicable comparing to in the small molecule era when you come up with a drug for hypertension, there are literally billions of people around the world that could use that drug. But now when you come up with a very specific biologic cancer drug that targets a specific type of protein or mutation, the group of people that could use that drug is smaller. And also the other factor is that there's just more negotiation power from the government because they're spending so much money on healthcare. I mean, we've all heard about the healthcare cost trend increasing for government because of aging population, because of more medical therapies coming to market. So they're spending a lot of money on drugs and different type of healthcare treatment. So they're negotiating harder as well for these therapies. So that's on the numerator part of the return equation. And then on the denominator part, it just simply costs more because some of the low-hanging fruits have been captured. If you can think about hypertension, that disease area was much easier, I guess, from an R&D perspective to treat 20, 30 years ago. But now when you need a biologic, you really have to go through a big process of discovering monoclonal antibodies and applying them to different animal models, taking them through different stages. It's much harder. It's more complicated science-wise. And also there is a higher regulatory bar because there has been cases in the past where drugs have come to market and they've had really bad side effects and the pharma companies had to withdraw them from the market. So there is a higher regulatory bar to bring drugs to market. There is more data required from trials. And because the population, as I talked about, are smaller, it's more expensive to do these medical trials because you have to go around the world to find the very targeted population that is suitable to test these type of drugs. So the cost of bringing drugs to market, so the denominator of that equation is also higher.
Have companies been able to resolve that in a way through pricing, or have those government purchasing power just been so strong? Because I imagine to make a treatment or the cost of the R&D worthwhile, the company has to be assured of being able to price in a certain way, just given the smaller applicability or the smaller market. Is that come to bear?
When you look at the cost of bringing one drug to market and then the return that you could get on that drug, like let's just say a cancer drug, it's still a very much of a very high return on comparing to low cost. I think I did a back of the envelope calculation. It could be anywhere from 5 to 10 times return on the return, but you have to go through hundreds or thousands of these molecules to bring a drug to market. So when you put the two, the numerator and denominator together, as an industry, the trend has just been declining. And some companies have been able to have a much better hit rate than others.
Well, that was going to be my next question, Ahmed, is just, so is general trend across the board, but are there certain pockets of the market that have been able to avoid this, or is this just kind of every healthcare company is facing these issues?
No, I think it does apply to the industry, certainly. I think with our process, we're a lot more bottom-up oriented. And so certainly there are some headwinds for the entire industry, but we're able to focus on certain companies that can do well despite some of these headwinds. And so we've been able to find certain companies that have structural tailwinds, for instance.
So for these companies, what are they doing to counteract this trend toward declining returns? What's effective?
I was going to say just part of what you said, Rob, just in terms of pricing new innovation at a higher and higher value, I think is one of the things that they've done. Certainly the like-for-like inflation for branded drugs is not as high as it was probably 10 years ago. But whenever there's a innovative new drug, then there's still the ability for some of these companies to price at a very high value.
I mean, have you seen this in valuations as well? Has this just made, either on a multiple basis, is healthcare just more attractive optically as a result of some of these aspects? In other words, has the industry become more value-oriented because of this?
I think what I've seen in valuation for big pharma companies is that the multiples have come down and people are paying less for the pipeline, more willing to pay for existing assets. And then even in today's world, I see that some biotech companies, they actually get quite a bit of valuation for the expected type of drug like in the pipeline because perhaps they have a really unique asset or perhaps they can kind of tell the narrative that they have a really differentiated research and development technology. Whereas for the big pharmas, the majority of the valuations seem to be based on the existing drugs that are already launched.
I think for me, yeah, similar to what Seeing is saying, there seems to be this bifurcation where you have some of the larger pharma companies whose multiples maybe have come down a little bit, and they're basically trading where you'd expect a distributor to be trading. I think their business model has shifted a lot more towards that of a distributor, where they're really not doing a lot of the R&D themselves, but acquiring much of that in-house. And what their focus is really on the sales and marketing piece, as well as on perhaps the later stage of commercialization. But then on the other hand, you also have the companies that are generating a lot of value and their multiples are still quite high. Those are the ones that are actually doing some of the core R&D, like on new innovative gene therapies or mRNA vaccines and so on.
And maybe that's a place to dig in the sense that despite these headwinds, we've got a decent amount of pharma exposure within our portfolio. So clearly we're seeing areas that are looking attractive in which to invest. I wonder if we could go through a couple of categories with respect to business models and where competitive advantages lie. And so maybe, Ahmed, just to build on that first one, and actually, I don't know if Seeing this is maybe more appropriate for you to speak to, just given that it's held in our international portfolio, but this idea of completely getting out of the game of R&D and just focusing on the commercialization. Recordati is a name that comes to mind. Can you talk a little bit more about why that seems to be an attractive business model with competitive advantages?
Sure. Recordati is a Italian company, and the industry likes to call this type of business model specialty pharma. Essentially, they don't do any R&D, as you said, Rob, and they acquire either in-license or they acquire drugs from other companies that's already been developed and marketed, and they sell it through their sales and marketing network. I think the competitive advantage is really around the management's ability to deploy capital and management's ability to understand how much an asset is worth and be able to sales and be able to distribute it better than others. And on top of that, be able to value the asset very well. And I think essentially the investment thesis we have behind the company Recordati is that we think the management's ability to allocate capital as well as to execute are very good. And it also has to be in a market where I think Europe is unique in the sense that they have most of their asset drug selling in Europe. And Europe is unique in the sense that it's a very fragmented market, many countries, many languages. So there is some difficulty, some barriers to entry in terms of building that sales and marketing network and also the understanding of how to navigate the regulatory landscape in different countries around Europe. This is sort of a unique business that we've been able to find in Europe.
And I'm just trying to connect it to the equation with the numerator and the denominator that you were talking about earlier. I guess the benefit here is that they have a lot more visibility onto the denominator, presuming that they've got this discipline in allocating capital. You kind of know how much you're going to spend for an asset. That takes care of the denominator. So you can really focus on the numerator and just making that as efficient as possible.
And comparing to a company that's bringing a drug from phase one all the way to marketed drug, they also have much better visibility on the numerator as well, because a lot of the drugs that they acquire have already been in the market for a few years.
That's great. I mean, we still own companies that are taking drugs and treatments from phase one and really discovery all the way through. Ahmed, maybe just one of the recent additions we've had to our portfolio is NovoNordisk. They seem to be a company that has a tremendous degree of focus around that drug development pipeline. Maybe just speak to that company and why we own it in our portfolios.
We recently added NovoNordisk to the global equity portfolio. And I think one of the things that's unusual about them is that unlike some of the other big pharma companies that focus on a number of different therapeutic areas, NovoNordisk generates most of their revenues from a single one, from diabetes. And they've been focused on this market for nearly a century now. They have the largest share within diabetes, and perhaps because of that, they have access also to the best R&D talent working within this therapeutic area. And this has helped them to consistently innovate in this area. So they've come out with novel drugs like longer lasting insulin and a new category of anti-diabetic drugs as well called GLP-1 agonists. And they're finding new use cases for some of these therapeutics as well in areas like obesity that provides good optionality for them going forward. So that's one example of a wealth creating pharma business that we view as having a good management team and an attractive valuation.
It almost sounds like, I mean, John Wilson has talked about when you're looking at growing by acquisition in general, just a preference that we have for this cookie cutter growth. So staying within your circle of competence. It sounds like that's pretty much what Nordisk is trying to do, just knowing their area of genius, as it were, and sticking to it.
That's right. Yeah. I think they've had this structural advantage of having limited competition within this one area that they've chosen. And they've also been able to benefit from sort of adjacencies that lend themselves to transferring this core competency that they have in perhaps endocrinology in general to areas like obesity that lend themselves well to that.
Great. And seeing, I mean, we do own businesses that are not as perhaps focused as the two that we've talked about so far. I'm thinking about a Roche, for example. Where does that fit in? And I guess just to direct the question a little bit further, I mean, when looking at pharmaceutical companies that are developing treatments across a range of applications, what gives you as an investor confidence that their ability to be effective in terms of the research and development efforts over our time horizon are going to play out?
I think it's very difficult to find the answer to that because it takes a median of 14 years now from the discovery phase of a drug and to bring it to market. At the meantime, you have all these other assets And if you're just following one molecule, that is, but in the meantime, you have all these other molecules that's moving through the pipeline and being marketed or falling out of the pipeline. So it's definitely a very big question to answer. And for Roche specifically, it is, I guess, still a little bit more focused than some of its peers, maybe in the pharma. It is a very, very large company. It likes to be more focused on oncology and central nervous system. And these are more difficult areas. So I think when the company is more focused in its research and development efforts, it gives it an incremental edge to it. And then for when it comes to merger and acquisition, which is a big part of capital allocation now for these large pharmas, Roche likes to buy more preclinical targets comparing to some of its peers where they spend billions of dollars buying late phase drugs. And that could be better if their competitive advantage is in developing these drugs throughout in the development phase and then marketing them. Typically, if a molecule is acquired in the preclinical stage, they don't have to pay as much. But then, of course, the risk is much higher than acquiring something that's in the late stage. So I think incrementally, Roche over a long period of time has been able to demonstrate that, but it is a hard factor to track. And sometimes one may not know until 5, 10 years later that the average return on capital has declined for this specific company or not. I think another big piece for our investment thesis behind Roche is the valuation. So just how much are we paying for the existing asset versus the asset in the pipeline? And for Roche, at this point, it seems that the market is fairly focused on, they have three large biologic drugs that came off patents a few years ago, and the market is pretty focused on the biosimilar erosion and its impact on Roche and its revenue. So the market is a little bit pessimistic around the company. So there is opportunities that we can trade around kind of the market sentiment versus what we really think their assets are worth. And I think the market at this point is not paying too much money for their large pipeline of asset at all. So valuation is another piece that we do think about. And then the last point is portfolio diversification or its investments impact on the rest of the portfolio. So usually these pharma companies, they have a complete different cycle than the rest of the portfolio companies. They're not really affected by the economic cycle. So that's helpful as well, just from a portfolio diversification perspective.
This whole conversation about what it takes to launch a successful drug actually has me thinking back to another recent podcast that we did on the gaming industry, meaning that it's about the ability to generate games that will be hits and then your ability to monetize that over time. Just thinking about another stock that we own in Genmap, they just seem to be one of these companies that generates hits. They seem to have a high hit rate on developing drugs. Now, I assume you pay up more for that, but how do you think about that, just the opposite end of the valuation spectrum and extrapolating some of that success that they've had?
GenMap is where one, I actually looped Ahmed in earlier in the process as well to really try to understand if they do have an edge in their research and development strategy. GenMap is a very large biotech company, and they are more focused on developing drugs from scratch. They don't spend much money on acquiring molecules or acquiring other companies comparing to other large pharma companies. And I guess the differentiation between biotech and pharma is whether one does its own distribution or not. And as of now, Genmap generates most of its sales from royalties, so it doesn't do its own drug distribution. And again, it's very hard to know because the problem with these biotech companies is that they don't have as many assets in their portfolio. So for Genmap, actually, one asset called Darzalex, that's more than 50% of the net present value of the company. So when you have one hit drug, and Darzalex is a $10 billion drug, so when you have one large drug, successful drug like that, of course your return on investment is going to look phenomenal. Well, I think one calculation I made was they had like over 1,000% on their research and development. Of course, you can't, as an analyst, you can't just extrapolate that they can have this type of return on the next 100 molecules, and then this company would just be worth infinite value. So the way that we investigated their research and development process was through a two-pronged process. one by looking at it theoretically, and the other one is empirically. Theoretically, we want to understand whether the design of research and development process was unique, and we interviewed different experts as well as read different scientific journals to understand how is their research and process different from others. And what we found is that they have this process where it allows them to create bispecifics, which is the next generation of antibodies. And that's where most of their focus is on bispecifics. They have this process that allow them to create bispecifics more effectively, both from a cost and a time perspective. We think that their process allows them to essentially throw more spaghetti at the wall and see which ones stick. And it is differentiated from some of the other companies when they try to create bispecifics. And empirically, we also wanted to look for evidence that theoretically they have this process, they can test more bispecifics out, but is it actually effective? Is it actually a more effective molecule than what other companies are bringing to market? And we tracked how bispecifics in clinical trials have evolved over the last 2 years and was able to find that their molecules progressed faster through the phases than, I guess, some of the other companies that we were comparing them to that also claim to have a bispecific platform. And we also saw more bispecifics developed by genmap came into clinical trial. So both of these pieces of evidence gave us some comfort that their technology is differentiated and potentially more effective than other companies. The caveat is that the process for research development is very long. The median time to take a drug from preclinical discovery phase to market phase is 14 years. And there are many things that could happen during that period of time. A competitor could launch a product that's a few years ahead of genmap, and maybe their product is not as effective as that of genmap's, but already taken up by patients and doctors, and the industry have less inclination to switch treatment, or that other companies could just get lucky and genmap could be looking at thousands more molecules in the same therapeutic area, but another company could look at fewer and just come up with a more effective drug because a lot of it is in the drug discovery industry is luck related. So I think we take the evidence that we collected through our research process and understanding that there's also a lot of different factors. Not everything is under your control when it comes to drug development.
Got it. So just thinking back on some of these various businesses that we've discussed, it seems like ways to combat declining returns are to get focused, to have better technology, to focus on an aspect of the drug life cycle where you think you have a competitive advantage, or to buy these companies when they're a little bit cheaper, which I guess is a time-tested element of having a margin of safety. Before we move on, we've talked a lot about pharma companies. There are other ways to get access to healthcare trends other than specifically through pharma companies. Wondering if you can talk to some of those, either that we've looked at or that we own in our portfolios today.
Yeah, it's a good point, Rob. I think we try to benefit from suppliers to these pharma companies that are more agnostic to what specific innovative drugs are actually commercialized. And so we've got a number of those within the US equity portfolio. Ones that come to mind are Waters, which develops instruments for the quality testing of pharmaceutical drugs. They have a high share within there. And then a few others as well are West Pharmaceutical and Avatar, both of which develop the packaging for these pharma drugs, especially the biologics. And they have a high market share as well in these areas.
I think what's interesting there is just the approval process, where it's not just the drug that gets approved, but it's also the way the drug is delivered. So the dispensing mechanism is part of the drug approval, which, like we were talking about before with seeing, is just, it's difficult to switch out of once you've agreed to a particular supplier.
That's right. These manufacturers are often spec'd into the approval, and the packaging material is a pretty low cost relative to the actual retail value of the drug. And so the incentive for switching over to another vendor that might be slightly cheaper, it's just not as compelling.
I mean, broadening out again, We're recording this podcast effectively exactly a year since we've been working from home. And hard to get through a conversation about pharma or healthcare without asking how COVID has impacted the industry. And I guess thinking about the near term first, just what we've seen over the past year or just over a year, how has that impacted some of these trends that we've talked about?
At least some of the companies that we cover within the US universe, we've seen really a bifurcation of response where you have some of these companies that have benefited a lot from COVID-19. These would be companies that are involved in diagnostics for the virus and also ones that are involved in the bioprocessing of the therapeutics related to COVID-19. And then on the other hand, you have several companies that have been negatively impacted from fewer elective surgeries, for instance, in hospitals. And so I think the short-term to medium-term impact on the industry would just be normalization as you see hospitals beginning to increase their capacity again, recovering from sort of the shutdowns, as well as maybe lower demand for things like diagnostic tests and therapeutics related to COVID-19.
Seeing what about longer term? What are some aspects of COVID that might stay with us in the context of what we've been talking about?
In longer term, I think some of the companies that we've seen, even outside of healthcare, for example, the testing, inspection, certification companies that we invest in, they're talking about requiring more PPE equipment to be tested and inspected, and governments talking about having better inventory of these items should another pandemic occur. I believe in the healthcare system itself, other than the drugs that are vaccines are immediately related to COVID, I agree with Ahmed. I think I just see a normalization over the long term.
I think, too, over the long term, you might have just, if you reflect on how we can deal with the next pandemic better, you might focus on things like just a better centralized response by governments, as well as more investments in infrastructure that we can ramp up diagnostic testing and ramp up manufacturing and distribution of vaccines the minute that they're approved. I think the benefit of having some diversification within healthcare is that we can perhaps benefit from some of these low-tech investments in infrastructure. And this would be maybe companies that we own in the portfolio, like AmerisourceBergen, which is a distributor of drugs, and some of the packaging companies as well that we talked about, Aptar and West Pharmaceuticals. These are all low-tech solutions, but I think that they could all benefit from investments that could be made down the line as we consider how to react quicker and more efficiently to the next pandemic.
And we've touched on this a little bit, but what about the role of government? I'm just thinking about this idea of it's harder and harder to produce or develop new drugs or treatments. There seem to be clear benefits toward this more personalization of treatments. But if the economics aren't there for companies or businesses to invest, do you see an increasing role for government in effectively funding some of this research and development over time? Or how do you see that partnership between the private and public space evolving?
Absolutely. I think the government is already playing a big role in terms of funding healthcare expenditures. Various government programs like Medicare and Medicaid in the US, for instance, they would probably account for at least half of all healthcare expenditure in the US. And so I think that that role is only going to get bigger over time. You think about the aging population, you're seeing that, and some of these entitlement programs like Medicare, they're basically focused on the 65 plus population, which is only getting larger. And so just by virtue of that, I think you're going to see the government playing a bigger role in all of this. The other thing to keep in mind is that at least pharmaceutical drugs, they only account for a small portion of overall healthcare expenditure, with very large portions being what's spent on hospitals and what's being spent on doctors that work at hospitals. And so I think there's a lot of attention that's often given to the pharmaceutical industry, but there's many other ways that we can think about making the system more efficient.
So I guess where does that leave us with respect to the pharmaceutical industry in general? I mean, these headwinds, I'm detecting a sense of optimism, knowing that it's a more podcast. I presume that it's going to be that we got to look business by business and look at things on a bottom-up basis. But are we trending in the right direction globally and on this topic, or some of these improvements, like you said, on the distribution side that can make things better?
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. From our perspective, when we make investments, we still have to look at the businesses one by one fundamentally. I think as a sector, there will always be opportunities to invest, whether it be from valuation perspective or from finding the business model that really brings a differentiated value to the consumers. I see that the large pharmaceutical companies, they may evolve into either one that's even better at doing merger and acquisition, finding the better preclinical targets, or ones and then develop them through bringing them to market. Or there are many other types of business that help the pharmaceutical companies offload some of the operation process, such as there are these contract outsourcing organizations. They help pharma companies conduct clinical trials, or there are outsourced biologic manufacturers. One company called Lonza, for example, they build these plants around the world to help pharmaceutical companies have more flexibility in manufacturing capacity for when they manufacture biologic drugs. So yes, there is that trend of declining return, but there is also still many therapeutic areas to target and many ways we can combat disease. And when there are needs, there are opportunities.
The few other things I'd highlight are just like we spoke about earlier, there's a pretty robust demand for all of this, for new innovative pharmaceutical drugs as the population ages. And then also one of the reasons that we like pharma is because it tends to be uncorrelated with the economy. Even as there's a recession, what have you, that people still need medicines for chronic conditions. And then the last thing I'd say is just on regulations. We always take a negative bias towards them, but in reality, I mean, these regulations are also in place to lock the status of a given therapeutic for a number of years and ensure that the pharmaceutical company can generate a reasonable return from them. And so I would see it as more of a mixed blessing than chronically negative.
Perfect. Well, Ahmed, seeing that seems like a good place to end. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking about the work that you've done together. I certainly learn a lot about the industry in general, as well as where we've been allocating capital. So very much appreciate your time today.
All right. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob.
Hi, everyone. Rob here again. To subscribe to the Art of Boring podcast, go to more.com. That's mawer.com/podcast, or wherever you download your podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on iTunes, which will help more people discover the Be Boring, Make Money philosophy. Thanks for listening.